There we go. So yes, this is a late-breaking paper, which means I have 10 minutes of your attention, so I'm going to try and be very quick. I'm presenting this project on behalf of myself and my collaborators, Daniel Allington and Byron Dueck, who are at the Open University. One thing I found out, being in Slovenia, I found out that our project's acronym, VEM, is the Slovenian word for I know, yeah, which is wonderful. Serendipity. So, what we're looking at in this project, valuing electronic music, how do you measure or assess or capture cultural value? We touched on this a little in the panel discussion yesterday, this idea of understanding subjectivity, understanding of aesthetics. Can we do this with a computer? This is my attempt to say, perhaps. So we're focusing specifically on electronic music because it's a short-term project, so bring the boundaries in. And when we started work, our questions were, who are the main players in electronic music? Terrible pun, no laughs at all, okay, I'll drop that. And also, on a more local level, who values who? Which musicians value other musicians, and how do they actually show this? How do they show their appreciation? So what we're doing, it's a very tangled mixture of qualitative and quantitative work. So I'm much more on the quantitative end, and we go to Byron Dueck, who's a musicologist on the project, an ethnomusicologist. We are using interviews with electronic musicians based in London. I need to talk to some of you later. And also, we're using the website SoundCloud, which is a social network for musicians, heavily populated by electronic musicians. It seems to be, in one guise or another, the dominant type of music you find on SoundCloud. And it's a social network for musicians to interact. So we're using the two forms of research and various things alongside to combine together and explore this question of how value is shown for music, electronic music. Oops. So I'm going to focus on the SoundCloud data analysis today. So how do users actually interact on SoundCloud? How do they use the social network? So they can follow other users, they can like somebody's track, and they can comment on somebody's track. There are other ways that they can interact as well. They can create playlists of tracks, and they can join groups of users. But in practice, we found these two options aren't so widely used. So I believe we have Kirsten Miner in the room. Yes. And also another one of our subjects, Bowen. So this is an example of the types of interactions. So you are following only two people.
Amazing.
But you have 348 followers, congratulations. And so this is the kind of interactions that we're looking at, and this is the kind of data that we can pull from SoundCloud. They've got a very good API. So this is the part of the talk where I stick to the paper, and then because this is a late breaking paper, I will then go beyond what I've actually put in the paper. We have some more findings. So we concentrated originally on big data methods. Who are the most top-ranked users? Who have got the most followers? Who are ranked the highest in terms of in-degree analysis, using PageRank algorithms? So we have this list of our top 10 users in a particular sample that we took. And we have our little diagrams of the networks of how people follow each other. And the networks, we've tried to prune them a little bit to make them more readable. So the diagram furthest on the left is the network of all connections. And then we remove people who don't follow anyone else in SoundCloud, so people who aren't interacting in that way. And then we remove people who don't have any followers. And slowly we're getting a bit more readable diagrams. But the problem all the way through was that this isn't useful for us. We could have written the top 10, probably, give or take. We know who the bigger players are, the really key people are. And the diagrams, this is a sample of 500 users. SoundCloud has millions. It's not telling us very much. And there's also a big mismatch with what we were finding out in the interviews. This goes back to Simon's comment yesterday that when we go off and do this computational creativity work, we're thinking about it from our perspective, our own small, limited experiences. But actually, once you go out there and talk to the people who are doing this stuff, talking to the musicians and finding out from a range of people what's important to them, that's when the useful stuff comes in. So this has changed our direction. So rather than concentrating on who are the big players, who are the key musicians, we found there's so much more interest in the smaller groups, the sub-networks within the bigger network. And the word relationship has come up in, I think, almost every single interview we've done. Oh, I've just primed you for the interview. I forget I said that. So this idea that people are much more interested in building up relationships within smaller networks. So we found, I won't go into this, but we found that there are very definite clusters of genres. So people are particularly interested in the more urban genres, and they build their own networks around that cluster, or in things that are more house music, EDM, dance music, or other types entirely. So genre has a big influence on how you interact with people. You're not necessarily that bothered about what happens with people outside of your own interested networks. And there's also a geographical influence that we found. So some of our subjects that we've looked at, they have very clear links with people in particular areas. And it's because they talk to them in the real world, in the offline world. And that comes through in what's happening in SoundCloud. And as we've spoken to other people, what they do in SoundCloud has influence on what happens when they're promoting their music back in the offline world. I put in this picture here, just to illustrate this a little bit more. This is a venue that I was at last night with a couple of people. It's called AKC Metokova, a cultural centre. It used to be a military barracks and prison until the 90s. And then, since then, the structures have been retained, but it's been turned into this graffiti-strewn set of venues, very alternative, very underground. So the people going to gigs here don't care about who the top 10 people on SoundCloud are. They have influence, they're showing their interest, and the venue is giving influence to people on a much more local level, a much more underground level. So one thing we've particularly started being interested in recently are comments. So people build up relationships by commenting on each other's tracks. So in this diagram, you have the little floaty avatars. The circles represent tracks, and if they're linked together, then they are tracks by the same user. The green flash means that they are creating a track. The orange flash means that they're commenting on each other's tracks. And you see this hive of activity that's going on. This is where people are building up influence with each other, interacting, and this is where there's value being shown in these comments, these conversations. So I have no minutes left, so I'll stop there. So what I want to conclude is that we are finding, for social network analysis, to understand cultural value, it's not the bigger picture, it's the smaller little pictures. So we're looking for how people build up relationships. There's the project website where we're announcing various results, and I've got some flyers with me which I may leave somewhere at some point, or I've got them with me anyway. I shall stop talking there and see if I have time for questions.
You have time for questions. Thank you very much. That's how to do a short talk. One point and lots of pictures. It's really good. So, questions, anybody? Yep.
Maybe an approach to address this topic would be doing graph analysis and subgraph mining, which represent sub-patterns within a bigger graph.
Yes, so that's something we're looking at quite a lot now. The question is what graphs to draw, because there are so many interconnections with people. So we're just trying to work out now what connections to ignore and what connections are really meaningful. But yeah, that's the kind of thing we're looking at with the quantitative side of things.
Ollie, as briefly as possible, please.
Thanks, that was a really interesting talk and area, so I'll definitely be following them. You alluded to the kind of distortions you might get. So for example, that list of top people, I've never heard of. I heard of two of them. I'm probably out of touch, but I think it's just really a comment that the issues of dealing with the kind of distortions of how people use SoundCloud, how people follow each other is quite challenging. And I think it's a really interesting area that I can see how there's going to have to be a lot of work in kind of dealing with those distortions compared to the real world.
Yeah.
If you have any comment on that.
That's the absolute crux of this project, which has been so useful working with qualitative information as well as the data analysis. The two are feeding into each other, and we're finding out where to concentrate our efforts because there's so much data to explore as well. And so where should we focus things? Well, let's talk to the musicians themselves and find out.
Okay, I'm afraid we don't have any more time for questions, but I'm sure Anna will be happy to discuss later. Thank you very much.